Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Brenda, for the introduction. Thank you, Elizabeth, for your fine interwage, Morag McLaughlin. And also thank you, Madeline, for a very generous description of what I was about to do in the latest issue of the VHS newsletter. In fact, I looked at it and I thought, my God, it's much better than anything I could do. So there we are. My intent this evening is not so much to talk about my new book, Abenaki Daring, and some copies of which I was asked to bring along in case anybody wants one. It costs me $25, and if you're interested, there's some out in the outside. But I want to take you along in the winding process which resulted in its publication. I expect most of us here in this room, and I know an awful lot of you have written some, or have at some point written about something that interests us. And it's either for publication or to satisfy ourselves. In doing so, I'd like to think that we each reflect a bit on why it is that we do, where it takes us, and where it might not lead us. And all of these kinds of things I encountered in this project. We all incur debts, as well as mine is to Morag, of course, also to Bruce Watson for his unstinting assistance and support along the way, and to my husband Roderick for putting up with Noel Annance as a third part of our family for some time. My search for Noel Annance began, as Elizabeth said, with a phone call half a dozen years ago in 2011. Morag, who I knew casually, invited me over to her house for morning coffee, and knowing Bruce was a much closer friend than I was, and I'm not sure whether it was Morag or it was myself, we invited Bruce to come along. The carefully organized piles of paper laid on the table should have alerted me this was no ordinary visit. I knew Morag principally as the author of the fine Fort Langley Journal, published in 1999, and this image being honored is thanks to the generosity of longtime VHS member Mary Lou Stathers. It's very difficult. The one thing I discovered in my search for Morag is it's almost impossible to find pictures of her. I've talked to many, many people. They say, of course I know Morag. Well, did you take a picture of her? No. So she's, in this sense, has got her own kind of ethos about her. Morag, at this morning coffee, mentioned Noel Annance, who you heard was an Abenaki from Quebec who was active in the Pacific Northwest fur trade, who in time at Fort Langley, and I think she knew him most intimately about his time at Fort Langley because she was doing the Fort Langley Journal. And she published an article, which is, I think, one of the most important articles ever published in the Beaver magazine, which is subsequently renamed Canada's History. And this is to quote her apt title, Morag made the case for Francis Noel Annance. And this article described how he was born in 1792. He was descended as well as from Abenakis, who are an Indigenous people in Quebec, sort of not that far east of Montreal. But he was descended from two New England child captives. And his inheritance resulted in an invitation to attend a Protestant missionary school in New England, followed by Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. These images depict the founding of Dartmouth College, which was from its beginning as romanticized here, intended to serve Indigenous as well as white students. I'm sure you have no trouble spotting who the two Indigenous students are in this image, which goes back fairly long to the beginning of the school. And this is Dartmouth College, in a sketch done by a student at about the time that Noel attended in the beginning of the 19th century. And you can see that it was, from its early days, a fairly reasonably pretentious place. Again, Morag talked about his career as an officer in the British side during the War of Independence, during the War of 1812, during which he distinguished himself in the Battle of Chateauguay, which is one of the main battles in the war, and got a medal, which, ironically, in my search, I had no idea the medal. Where is the medal? What is the medal? And I actually found it online for sale on eBay. There's somebody, so you know, the world goes around, it comes circles around. Morag went on to describe Noel's decade in the Pacific Northwest fur trade, serving under the Northwest Company and then the Hudson's Bay Company, until he was drummed out, almost certainly because he was Indigenous, which I'll get back to. Morag then ended the article with Noel's return home to St. Francis, Quebec, to farm and teach school, which is this, you can see St. Francis, and you can also see the two, in New Hampshire, where he went to school. What else did Morag share on that morning? Then came the point of the visit. This is the only other picture I found of her, by the way. Then came the point of the visit, a request by Morag that the project she began with a long ago Beaver article be brought to completion by securing the publication in their entirety of 2 pieces of Annance's writing that she had uncovered along the way. The first item Morag shared was a journal that Noel kept while in the Pacific Northwest on a very important exploratory expedition whose goal was to connect the 2 halves of the Pacific Northwest, which the Hudson's Bay Company based in London had just acquired by virtue of merging with the Northwest Company out of Montreal. One half centered on present-day Portland, Oregon, which is where Fort Vancouver is, and the second on today's Prince George, British Columbia, which at that point was named New Caledonia or New Scotland. Noel's journal began, and you can see this day we left this place on an expedition to the mouth of Fraser's River, which is supposed to empty itself in Puget Sound. And this is the point where there are very, very, very few non-Indigenous people here, and the geography is largely unknown. And at this point, I want to just say as an aside, I suspect that Noel Annance at this time was the most highly educated person in the Pacific Northwest, because most of the men in the fur trade didn't have the education that he had. And here, our party, headed by James McMillan, Esquire, consists of 3 clerks, and one of these is Noel, an interpreter, and 36 men. Having crossed the bay, we camped in the west of it, beginning the portage, blah, 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 blah. The plan was to reconstruct a new trading post linking the 2 halves of the Pacific Northwest, which were completely disconnected, never had been connected with each other, which would become Fort Langley. And it was for this trip that Annance is remembered in British Columbia by virtue of the officer in charge naming an island after him as they passed by the future New Westminster. Annacis Island became today's Annacis Island. And Noel did not write about the honor in his own journal, but this excerpt comes from a fellow officer along on the trip. And for those of you who don't know where Annacis Island is, which is what it became, Annacis Island became slurred into Annacis Island. It's on this map, today's map of today's Fraser River, right off of New Westminster. It's the closest we physically come to Noel having passed along the Fraser River, not far from where we are this evening. I had a dispute with somebody who shall be nameless about whether I should be giving a talk, because this talk was not about British Columbia, it's not about Vancouver. You see, well, he was sort of almost saw the future of Vancouver when he went down the river. But, and we can all go have a little visit to Annacis Island and say, yes, it's okay. The second piece of writing that Morag wanted published in their entirety were the love notes Noel wrote during his final fur trade posting, which was in the far north, intended to keep him out of the way until his contract was up. There he spent a long, cold winter seducing the part Indigenous woman who was living with the officer in charge. And these are examples of what he wrote to her, endless. And the love notes survive. I mean, part of what I want to talk about is the process of putting this together. Why the love notes survive? Because the officer in charge kept a separate secret journal in which he found, eventually when he discovered the affair, he found the love notes, and he was so annoyed that he copied them all into the secret version of the journal. And so they, they are here today. And Morag quite cleverly found the second copy of the same journal in the archive, Hudson's Bay Archives now in Winnipeg, and sussed them out. Here it is, New Year's Day, January 1st, 1834. May bliss and joy crown over eternal love, and heaven grant our union happy prove. Reign a lively offspring in our tender care. You and I the pleasing task will share. Well, he wasn't meant to be a poet, we guess. And later on, in the everyday things that he wrote, this is January 16th, which time the relationship was in danger of being found out. Be easy, my dear love. I will not tear my heart to refuse anything you request. And the notes go on again. And all of the notes are included per Morag's request in the book which resulted. So this then was a task, to incorporate these 2 pieces of writing into some kind of coherent text meriting publication. Morag's passion was such, there was no thought of refusal, but what to do. How to go beyond the article. Teaching in a faculty of education, it seemed appropriate to start with Noel's schooling. So one day when I was feeling strong, I checked out the Dartmouth College archives online, And lo and behold, the skies open. Not only does Dartmouth hold detailed records going back to the college's beginnings, but also to that of the Protestant religious school that Noel earlier attended. They also had family correspondence, all of which they enthusiastically scanned for me, quite overwhelmed that someone actually wanted to see it. And the moral of the story is, I think it's better to ask and be refused than not to ask at all, as I almost did in this case. Included, and most importantly for my continuing on the project, was a single letter that Noel wrote just after leaving Dartmouth, indicating to me his intellectual capacity, self-confident writing style, and also his ability to sort of suss out, to realize what was wanted in particular circumstances. Penned in May 1815, Noel was making a request of Dartmouth's president, so it was strategically, necessarily obsequious, and he really worked at that one. May the everlasting God prolong your dear and useful life, and may he crown your labors with abundant success in your endeavors. To civilize poor and ignorant barbarians who sit in darkness is a prayer of your most humble and obedient servant, Jean Annance. I should add, the request, which was to admit 2 of his cousins to the school, was granted. To understand, I realized why not only Noel, but also numerous other family members seemingly cross the Indigenous white divide in respect to their formal schooling, I decided I wanted to read captivity narratives. How many people have read captivity narratives? Probably a generation or two. You've read, Bruce? You know, we probably read them a generation or two. I found out from, this is where the UBC library was amazing. I found out is that they were the kind of writing that one had to read, and the UBC library's got an amazing collection of them. And captivity narratives is a genre recognized within literature by whites, mostly in New England during the 1700s and 1800s, who had been taken captive by Indigenous people during wars and were ransomed. Returned captives wrote about their experiences, both as a kind of therapy or expiation, and also to attest to how terrible were Indigenous people, as indicated by the images that sometimes accompanied them. I just went, online to see what I could find, but these are typical of the kinds of images that were used and the ways in which the stories are told. So both of Noel's maternal great-grandparents had been captured just after 1700 as children, and according to a later Catholic priest who was stationed at St. Francis in his hometown, the Abenakis, and I quote, adopted them as their own children and treated them tenderly. Now these are his great-grandparents, so they're basically only, what does that make him, 1/4, 1/8 of his inheritance. It's not a huge amount of his inheritance, but it mattered. A glimmer of their lives survive in captivity narratives. I've read several of them, including a preacher's son who was taken captive also to St. Francis a year later. He described how, and I quote again, some English children would scoff at me before the Indians, worse than the Indian children. When alone, they would talk to me familiarly with me in English about their own country. The pair who were captured were in adolescence, married to each other, to have a large family, including a son who in due course became the Abenaki chief. Descendants' invitation to be educated in New England related, and I think most of you can guess why. If this were a class, I would ask, hold up your hand. But at this age, religion was absolutely central to everybody's life. And we wanted to convert the Indigenous people, but the Indigenous people were not particularly keen on being converted. And so the logic was, it was more likely to become good Christians, and then they would convert other people in their tribe, if in fact they had some partial white descent. They were capable of understanding by virtue of this partial white descent. And so it's about 1770 that Dartmouth and the school which connected with it, they literally went, rather like traveling salesmen, they went around looking for descendants of white captives. And they had heard about them, they made a list, they got to St. Francis, they found some, and that was when, in fact, it was Noel's father who was the first one who was recruited to go to this school and to go to Dartmouth because his white blood would win out. As for Noel, his problem was that he now was educated, but where was he going to go? His father had become the school teacher in St. Francis. He had been a beneficiary of this logic, which did not much assist Noel when it came to finding employment in the white world, which is what he had been trained for. Following his exemplary service in the War of 1812. Noel tried teaching in Quebec City, but as you can see from this advertisement, which was published in a Quebec City newspaper, the advert reads in the style of the day, classical education. Mr. Annance, who has been regularly educated, all of these words have significance, he's been regularly educated, respectfully informs the inhabitants of the city that he is desirous to receive a select and limited number of young gentlemen on the 1st of June to instruct in any of the following branches. There's mathematics, algebra, French language, syntactically, which is like grammar, whose improvement he will devote his most sedulous attention. Mr. Annance begs leave to refer to Mr. Collier, who will bear testimony to his moral character and professional capacity. The terms may be known in application to Mr. Annance, Mr. Collier's Academy at Mount Carmel, which is where Noel was then teaching, and was in fact the most prominent boys' school in Quebec City in the day. So he had, and it's difficult to know what happened next, because again, you're looking for material in the sources of time. It's, where do you go to find out what happened? What we do know is that Noel, very soon after that, turned to the fur trade. He applied, he was accepted as an officer, which was almost, would have been impossible for anyone who was Indigenous to do, except that he did have his almost Dartmouth graduation. He left in his last year because of the War of 1812, when in fact everybody else in the school volunteered on the American side. He was left to sort of make his own way. So he was in a sense he was white. Was he white? Was he not white? And there's an underside. Despite what seems to be, and Morag detailed this in length, exemplary service in the fur trade, this is the private and confidential assessment made in 1830 by the head of the Hudson's Bay Company in North America, George Simpson, who perceived Indigenous descent in and of itself as a fatal flaw. From his perspective, it was perceived that Noel would fail. I just want to read this. He's been a schoolmaster, an excellent classical scholar, but flighty and unsteady. Talks and writes nonsense. He knew Latin and Greek, and he often wrote in Latin and Greek. And he cannot be believed on oath. An excellent walker, good shot, firm and savage, whatever, and a good trader. And it was thereupon that Noel, after the time in the fur trade, was dispatched to the far north to work out his contract before being sent home to St. Francis. And that's where he spent the long winter engaged in seduction, whether that was because that was his nature or because he was not best pleased with what had happened to him. We'll have to, we have to think about that one for ourselves. Okay, now back. St. Francis is again where he's living. It's an Abenaki community. It's run by mostly uneducated, illiterate Abenakis. He was 43 years old, but what to do? I knew from Morag's meticulous research he married a young distant relative who was 15 or 16. He had a large family, all of whom seemed to have come to adulthood and married themselves. Was that all? So far my research had not much diverged from Morag's findings, which he'd elegantly summed up in his article. So what to do? I was reminded in pondering my options by the image of Abenakis from about this time by the well-known Quebec painter Cornelius Krieghoff, who lived nearby. And I wondered to myself for some time, is that all there was to Noel Annance? How was I going to persuade a publisher that there was a book here? Was there a book here? Then the Canadian Senate came calling, or rather phoning. The Senate Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs was holding hearings on the Métis in Canada. The Senate always wants to solve some major problem. They were going to solve this one. And they wanted me to testify, given I'd published on the topic in respect to British Columbia. This is the middle of the winter, and I equivocated. Ottawa in the winter? That's when my husband astutely turned my attention to what might be hidden away about Noel's later life in Library and Archives Canada. This at a time when the Conservative government's parsimony had resulted in microfilm no longer be available through interlibrary loan. So I said I'd go. And I negotiated to stay in Ottawa 3 extra days at my own expense and began scanning through Indian Department records filmed in the order papers had been gathered up, and they were never indexed because nobody really cared about them. Out of this random mess, I turned up during those extra 3 days the first of 2 or 3 of what would be a series of letters from Noel, whose handwriting I recognized because I luckily had the Dartmouth letter as an example of how he wrote. He was writing to government authorities respecting both his own circumstances and also the conditions of Indigenous people in Quebec and generally. So I returned to the archives during a trip to Ottawa not long after as an adjudicator for a national award, and again negotiated extra time, and several times on my own initiative. What I uncovered gave me pause and still does. This is the other Noel Annance. For a third of a century, he retailed to the Department of Indian Affairs both the inequitable and maltreatment of Indigenous peoples and what ought to be done, in his view, to remediate the situation. By virtue of going through reel after reel of microfilm, looking for Noel's distinctive handwriting, I uncovered 70 letters from him, 70 letters from him. And I also, I'm sure there are many more. I either failed to turn up, I went to sleep while I was reading the microfilm, or did not survive. 16 of the letters are included in their entirety in the book. To give you a sense of what I found, here is a short section from one of these more personal letters. Ever since Noel returned home, he wanted to teach in a local school, especially following his father's death, but he was repeatedly rebuffed due to the Catholic hierarchy's opposition, given his attendance at Protestant institutions. This letter from 1846 reflects both the government's confidence in its capacity, but their unwillingness to thwart the Catholic hierarchy, and his own self-confidence based on his higher education. Noel was by this time a regular correspondent, so much he felt comfortable describing a recent illness. I had the honor to receive your favor of the first instant, and in compliance with your request in the last part of your letter, I am happy to inform you that no one is better qualified and more disposed to be a teacher to my tribe than myself. And if agreeable to you, you have nothing to do but send me the instructions, then we will take the preparatory steps immediately. I have just recovered from the country cholera. I am with profound respect, your humble servant, Anna Annance. Noel would, due to the Catholic Church's hierarchy, continued opposition, never get an opportunity to teach in his home community, although he taught repeatedly in nearby schools for white settler children. Quite miraculously, I also uncovered in Library and Archives Canada a set of responses to Noel's letters. Even if not doing much to remedy the situation, his elegant writing style, which seems to have been unique among petitioners, merited a reply, and once in a while something actually happened. Now, I expect you may be wondering about now, what did I not find? Despite Morag's and my own searches, no image of Noel Annance appears to have survived. The closest I came to was his brother Louis, who, much as Noel attempted in the Pacific Northwest, Louis found his escape in northern Maine. He also attended secondary school, but he never went to Dartmouth. There he alternately raised a large family with many descendants in the present day, and quite consciously gave the emerging dominant society they wanted, which was his self-portrayal as a stereotypical Indigenous person. And by being a stereotypical Indigenous person, he actually, I think his plan was to then convince at least a few people that maybe they would not be quite as alien as they appeared to be in that day. I had no contact with the family, any of the family, until on publication of the book, I got an email of appreciation from one of Louis's descendants, and subsequently in the post, 3 jugs of maple syrup from his own sugar bush in Vermont. And that's the most amazing, amazing response to the book. I'm happy. I don't need to sell any copies. You know, it made a difference. And so we come to Abenaki Daring, The Life and Writings of Noel Annance, 1792-1869, published by McGill Queen's University Press at the end of 2016, whose cover evokes a key element to the story, which is the very expeditious Quebec Postal Service, making it possible for Noel to write as he did to Montreal, for the most part, or to Quebec City, and to get very prompt responses. It's quite amazing, much better than what we have at the present time. As to why McGill Queen's University Press, it was to return Noel's story so far as possible to his Quebec homeland. And yes, Morag's 2 requests, the travel journal and the love notes, are both included in their entirety in the book. And I must say, the only time that the publisher and the editor that I had said, "You're mad, woman, you're mad," was because I wanted to include the entire travel journal in the book, but it was that or no book, so it is there. Abenaki Daring is in sum the story of a single Indigenous person By virtue of his higher education, due to his long ago descent from child captives, was all his life caught between two ways of being. He was too indigenous to be accepted in the fur trade, too highly educated to fit in on returning home, or more generally in Quebec. Noel Annance did not crumple, but rather used his pen to detail to the government of the day Indigenous people's plight in a Canada in the making. Very importantly, the exclusionary policies generally considered to have originated with the Indian Act of 1876, whose consequences we lament today, were long in place well before then. And I read all of the government documents from this time period to see what was going on. Those in charge were very aware of what they were doing and did so knowingly in the interest of white folk and only of white folk. So we can be grateful that the Indian Department at least did keep Noel's letters, probably because they never bothered to organize anything, which a century and a half later serve as reminders of what might have been. Thank you. Okay.
Jean has kindly agreed to take some questions, and I believe we have a microphone.
There it is.
Are there any questions from the audience? I'm happy to begin because I just found the story of this man to be so moving, and I just would like to personally thank you on behalf of Greg and all of us, really, that you put this together, Jean, and it's quite remarkable just how you frame his story and really its significance for where we are today in our society. Kellen, did you have a question? Thank you.
Does this work? Yeah. Okay. I have a question about his family. So Noel, Noel seduced this lady, and then he went off and had another family?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure what you're talking about.
So he was writing love notes to various, when
he was writing the love notes in the far north. Yeah. He was writing them to the woman who was living with the head of the trading post.
And they were at the same trading post?
Yeah, he was the head of the trading post. Noel was sent there. It was far, 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 far north. Yeah. He spent 6 months traveling to get there, and she was linked to. She was, in a sense, she was in a family which was linked into the fur trade. She was a mostly indigenous woman, and he had been keeping her for about the past 10 years, and clearly she was. Not best pleased, and Noel was probably a hunky guy, I don't know. All I know is his brother. But in any case, they quickly engaged in a secret relationship, as these notes reveal. And they were caught out, and the person, the head of the post, had in his there's the journal, the official journal, and then there's this private journal. And he basically, from the time he set eyes on Noel, he just thought it was beneath his dignity of someone who was an Indian working for him and be a clerk, and someone that he had to invite to meals and he had to sit down at the same table with, and he's whining all the time. And Noel, of course, I don't have his words apart from the notes, but he was probably whining because he was sent up in the north because he had another year and a half for his contract, and by this time the head of the Hudson's Bay Company had basically told him, you know, you're an Indian, don't hang around anymore. And so it was a tinderbox. And it was a tinderbox in the middle of the winter, and these notes make very clear they were hidden, and they were passed through people who worked there back and forth without the person who head of the post finding out for about 3 months. And they actually, you know, they were sleeping together. He was going into her bedroom when the man in charge of the post was doing something else. It's a sort of little, you know, that could have been the theme of the story, you know, sordid love in the far north. But also, did you ask a question about Noel's family as well?
Yeah.
And what?
I might need the mic back so it's on the.
Oh, okay.
So then Noel went down and he started a family back
home. Well, let me go back to the love affair. Is that for a time you remind me? For a time she debated actually going off with Noel, but then she didn't do it. And the guy who was the head of the post was much older than she was. He had to leave in England. He took her to England. He promised he'd marry her in England. He didn't do it, and eventually they ended up being separated. He did everything to get her back. Noel went back home. Within a year, he married a young girl who was 16, who was sort of a second cousin. And they had a huge family of a dozen-plus children, all of who reached adulthood. And I didn't follow that because I wanted to avoid feeling like I was intruding into his private life. And I didn't follow the family of his brother either, except I said, I now got the maple syrup.
Right, and he does have, Noel still has descendants as well?
He has to have many hundreds of descendants, because his children mostly came to adulthood. But I say I've written a lot of books about, real people in the past, and there's always this kind of line as to where do you cross it and where you don't cross it. And I've always had a feeling that if people want to tell me their stories and say, yes, use my stories, then I will do it. But I don't want to go beyond. But the maple syrup allows me to do it. And it's very good maple syrup. Bruce can vouch for himself. He has one of the three.
Any further? Oh, yes.
This has to do more with Annacis Island, Jean. I'm just wondering, that island was named after him at what point?
I'm sorry?
At what point was the island, Annacis Island, named in his honor?
It was, as far as I can tell, it was in the journal, it was in his honor. When you look at, I've looked at the histories of New Westminster, that name continued from that period of time, but how that actual linkage between saying on the trip, as the other person on the trip says, that the guy in charge named it for Annance, because Annance was very valued in terms of the fur trade, as they were going by, and how it then continued to be the name. I couldn't find this out, but if you look at the early history of New Westminster, it's called either Annacis Island or Annacis Island, and Annance did spend a long time period at Fort Langley, which is how Morag became friends of his, so to speak. And so he was going back and forth a lot, and so I think that the connection, and he was respected at this point during the fur trade, from my assessment. And so it's very possible that other people who are going, back and forth from the point of view of the fur trade between its different poles in the Pacific Northwest, it became known as Annacis Island.
I'm just curious because this appears to be the only recognized memory of him here in British Columbia, correct?
Yeah. Well, there really wasn't any British Columbia in terms of British Columbia we know. Yeah.
But today,
no.
This is all we have to remember him here.
As far as I'm aware.
The second question, or third question, is this quickly: at what point do you know when the Grosvenors took over Annacis Island? Because they own most of that property that hasn't been sold. The Grosvenor family from England.
I don't know the history of it.
Okay.
I tried reading a lot about it, but the island didn't, at that point in time, everything belonged to Indigenous people.
Right.
And how it managed to retain its name, it's been something I've been curious about.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Good question. When you find out, let me know.
I will.
I think it's about 1952.
Oh.
And Warren Kennedy, the architect who became the city councilor in Vancouver, that I believe, if I remember the story correctly, that he came to Vancouver from Britain to work for the Grosvenors, who had the property on Annacis Island.
Yeah.
It was a planning thing then.
That's how it happened.
Hello. I'm curious to find out, I missed the first minute of your speech, then maybe you answer. Do you hear me? Okay, I missed the first minute of your speech, maybe the answer was there. My question is regarding the fact the religious community in Quebec kept a lot of archives or Quebec government archive maybe. Did you look at these for your work?
I looked at, I didn't go into the archives and go through the archives, but I looked online at the, what was held in Quebec archives. And there's a lot held in various Quebec archives. There's a lot in McGill. There's a lot of material on the fur trade in McGill. McGill University Archives did a great project in trying to get materials on the fur trade, but it doesn't mention him. I mean, I think the reality is, at the time he was in the fur trade, it was right at the beginning of the fur trade and actually of non-Indigenous people becoming part of the Pacific Northwest. So it's a very early time period, not the later time period. He was not a major person. So as far, if somebody can find about him, let me know. His name is sometimes spelled Annance, A-N-N-O-U-N-C-E, in materials I've uncovered.
And then where did he went to school? Is it in Saint Francois or Saint Francis in Quebec?
You're talking about where he went to school?
Yeah.
What happened was that the major school in New England for Indigenous children was at the location where Dartmouth College is founded. And before Dartmouth College was founded, it was called Moore's. And it was started by one of these zealous missionaries. And a whole 150, 200 students went through it during its history. And in fact, it's out of that school that the person who was in charge wanted more, and he started Dartmouth College as an adjunct of Moore's, as the two were very much linked. A number of American Indigenous leaders early on, Brandt, who you may know about, he attended Moore's, and it was a principal school in New England, and at that early time period in North America, where if you're an Indigenous person and you had the right linkages, you'd get schooling. The other situation was, which I looked at very closely, is what would happen if you went to higher education. And what you had, I went through American universities, as I had been long time ago in another life. I did graduate work at Harvard, and I remembered a little plaque which was on one of the buildings about there had been some Indigenous students there, and so I went back to look at what other colleges had and there were Harvard, Princeton, 2 or 3 others of the early major colleges, William and Mary. They admitted 3 or 4 Indigenous students. But why did they do it? They each did it because an English Missionist Society said, if you will enroll 1 or 2 or 3 Indigenous students, we'll give you funding. And so the students survived as long as the funding survived. And virtually none of them actually went anywhere. The ones at Harvard all, I mean, it's an impossible situation, because in order to go to a post-secondary university at that point, you had to know Latin, you had to know Greek, you had to know the classics. You had a whole kind of knowledge you could only acquire if you had been in another school, such as Moore's, from about the age of 8 or 10. And so they would try and, pick out what they thought were exemplary young Indigenous people to get their money, to get their funding, and then they, of course, couldn't survive, because you don't pick up Latin or Greek overnight, which was the expectation. So there was virtually no other option at the time that Noel got into Dartmouth through his captivity narrative, 2 captivity narratives, for an Indigenous person to want to be educated. There was a tiny bit through the Catholic Church in Quebec, but it was totally trivial. They sent 1 or 2 people to France to be educated, to become priests. But there was very little going on that I could find out in this time period. It just wasn't, it really wasn't a consideration. There were some, if missionaries were doing, all missionaries were doing in a local level was giving a very, very elementary education, enough so that you could maybe read the Bible, which was all that was considered necessary. In fact, for most white children, that was considered necessary. If you can read the Bible and enough so you can become religious, and that's what we want. So it's a very, very different time period. We're now talking about the beginning of the 18th century, over 200 years ago. No, 1800, 1900. Yeah.
Any further questions? Oh,
you say later they wrote books that weren't very positive towards their capture and what happened, but was there anything interesting that happened that you learned through those reports? I
didn't hear that.
He's asking about the captive narratives.
Oh, what, you're talking about captivity narratives. Captivity narratives, I think, were one of the most formidable and most important piece of writing during this time period, because people who were captured felt that they had to expiate themselves by telling their story of the kind of horrors that they endured. And some of them are telling stories of very kind and very gentle people that are looking after them. The situation in general was that there have been 2 or 3 comprehensive studies that I found. I am now an expert on captivity narratives for anyone who's interested. There was a study done of all of the captives and what happened to them and what, good research project, but it found that girls were almost always married off. They were married off to young Indigenous men if they were still there, and it seems as if they were a lot of the women, female captives, when they write their stories afterwards as well, they were not unhappy to get away from sort of the strict conventions that they had at home, and so it was not a totally one-way story. The young white boys fared much worse because there was no choice except for them to try to escape. A lot of adults were also captured and stayed for a long time. But the main reason for doing it was you could get a ransom. The families would pay to have you back. With Noel's great-grandparents, his father tried repeatedly to raise money from the local church, etc., for a ransom to get him back, but he could never arrange it because he wasn't rich enough. In the case of Noel's great-grandmother, during the raid, everybody was killed, and so she had no parents. It appears she had no parents to attempt to rescue her, and so that's one of the reasons that both of them were brought up by the Abenakis. And then there was a big debate, according to the local missionary, when they came of age, should they each be married into the Abenakis, or should they be allowed to marry each other? Because even then there was a sense that this would make something exceptional within the tribe if they married each other, because then they would have white Abenakis. And so that was the case that their eldest son then became the chief of the Abenakis, and he was very important during the American Revolutionary War, going back and forth between the two sides, the son of the captives. And so it was a community in St. Francis which had a considerable percentage of people who were of part white descent. There was also a branch of the family. There was a situation where one of the offspring of the first generation married sons of the first generation married white women. So you also had the branch of the family which was totally white. And by the time Noel Annance was a child at the beginning of the 19th century, those two sides of the families, the Gills were the white side, the Annances were the Abenaki side. They had completely separated. And the ones who were the white side, they wanted to get control of the village of St. Francis, and they managed to have a good shot at it until those who were on the Indian side, or those who were just Abenakis, managed to, with the help of the Indian Affairs people, to get them out of the town so they could no longer vote, so they could no longer be part of the village. But it was a whole number of villages were captivity. The descendants of captives lived in this intermediate sort of place. I'm now working on what happened with the Iroquois, particularly the Iroquois come west, and the Iroquois village, such as Kanawaki, which you know about today, which is what I've been working on. Well, that's a big issue now, if you know, that they're refusing to let people who have part white descent, women who, to stay in the community. It's been a big problem through the whole, the whole history of Quebec. Sorry, too long an answer, I apologize.
All right, well, I think unless there are any further questions, I would like you to join me in thanking Jean so much for coming.
In 1999 for her book, Street Names of Vancouver, which is a complete list and location of the original and renamed streets of Vancouver, accompanied by historical background. This invaluable book was a VHS project, and it remains a key reference source for all Vancouver history collections. Elizabeth is going to start the evening by giving us some background information and an introduction to Morag McLaughlin. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Walker.
Well, I hope you can hear me from the back.
Yeah.
Good. Well, tonight's talk is entitled Morag McLaughlin's Legacy, the story of Noel Annance. So I'm here to tell you a bit about Morag, my friend and fellow member of the Vancouver Historical Society. Morag was born and educated in Chilliwack. When I first met her, she had just lost her husband after less than 1 year of marriage, and she had decided to pursue a master's degree in history at UBC. She used to come in to the local history collection at the Vancouver Public Library where I worked to research the history of the Fraser Valley Milk Producers Association for her MA thesis. After obtaining her MA degree, she taught history at Langara College until her retirement in 1983. As a member of the Vancouver Historical Society, Morag contributed greatly to the many activities and programs. When it was a smaller society, she would bring cookies and coffees after the meetings. Long-time members will remember the 1989 and 1990 Incorporation Day dinners held at the Heritage Hall on Main Street, when she did the catering, including homemade bread, homemade slaw, and 3 different desserts. She served as a corresponding secretary in 1985, and in 1987 to 88 was the secretary. In 1998, she received the Society's Award of Merit for her contributions to local historical education and writings, especially her editorship of the Fort Langley journals of 1827 to 1830. For over 15 years, Morag transcribed and annotated the Fort Langley journals written by clerk George Barnston and Chief Trader James McMillan and Archibald MacDonald. She had to deal differently with the 3 authors, but she remained faithful to keeping as faithful as possible to the original journals. And in the course of her transcriptions, she became an enthusiastic fur trade historian. And she often invited other fur trade historians to her home to share their stories and ideas. Over the years, she had become interested and intrigued with the career of Francis Noel Annance, who in 1827 helped establish Fort Langley. And she began to research his life before and after his term with the Hudson's Bay Company. Realizing the enormity of research involved, she persuaded Jean Barman to take over the project, and she handed over all her material that she had gathered. Sadly, Morag died in October of 1911, but her legacy continues.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. It is now my great privilege to introduce our main speaker this evening. I think it's fair to say that she is our most distinguished member of the Vancouver Historical Society, and she is also a recipient of the VHS Award of Merit, which she received in 2003 for her contributions to Vancouver and British Columbia history. Esteemed scholar and teacher, she is Professor Emeritus at the University of British Columbia, Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and she has received so many honors that it would take most of the evening for me to list all of them. She is widely recognized as one of our nation's preeminent historians. Her output is prodigious. I did a check of her publications listed in the UBC Library catalog, and there were 66 hits, which of course does not include her many hundreds of articles and reviews and other writings. Her best-known books include The Foremost History of British Columbia, The West Beyond the West, A History of British Columbia, and her 2005 title, Secrets of Stanley Park. Members of the audience will know many of her other award-winning titles. She last talked to our group about her 2014 book, French Canadians, Furs, and Indigenous Women in the Making of the Pacific Northwest, which won the Basil Stewart Stubbs Award for Best Scholarly Book about British Columbia, as well as the gold medal from the Governor General. Tonight, we have another story and another book, and it is my great pleasure. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jean Barman.